Thank you. Hello. So what you're looking at is maybe the most exciting thing on our menu right now, or on our future menu. It's an odd thing for me to say because I'm not a baker, and we don't often think of bread, or wheat anyway, as being on some type of exciting culinary frontier, right? But this isn't just any bread. Because A, it's milled with whole wheat, real whole wheat. We bought a little industrial miller and we put it in the corner of our kitchen and we mill it just before we bake the bread. And B, the bread is made from an exciting new variety of wheat. It's bred by this man, Dr. Steve Jones. I challenged Dr. Jones to breed a delicious wheat that was nutritious, that had good yield for the farmer, that had good pest resistance, and so on. And he did it. And he's going to call it Barber wheat, and it's going to fast-track me to the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't work with Dr. Jones every day. I work here. Blue Hill at Stone Barns is located just 30 miles from Manhattan. It's an 80-acre working farm as part of the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture, with 10 acres of vegetables and this incredible 23,000 square foot greenhouse that produces vegetables year-round. And on the pasture surrounding the property is about 30 acres. We're raising pigs and sheep and chickens and geese, and we raise turkeys for Thanksgiving and honeybees. And then just 60 miles north of Stone Barns is the Blue Hill farm, my family farm, and that's the dairy farm. Grass-fed cattle for milk, cream, and veal calves. And there are, between the two farms, there's vegetables, there's fruits, there's lots of animal husbandry, there's dairy, and there's exciting things going on with all this stuff, but I'm not going to talk about any of it today. I'm going to talk about what's missing from our system. And I would argue what's missing from our conception of good agriculture and good cuisine, and that's wheat. We don't grow a teaspoon of wheat. And to be honest with you, up until a few years ago, I never really thought about it. Because my understanding of wheat is probably the same as yours. You don't grow this stuff in your backyard, right? 1,000-acre monocultures feeds the world. Someone just told me that 4.5 billion people, 4.5 billion, eat wheat every single day. So a system like this makes a lot of sense. But for us chefs, it's totally ironic. We are the messiahs for freshness. The priests and high priestesses of flavor. We want only, and we demand, and we usually get, only the most impeccable ingredients, right? The first asparagus from the farmer's market, the white truffle flown in from wherever, the ham that's fed impossibly large acorns, the single origin coffee for our coffee programs, the freshest fish, not even the freshest fish. We don't want to serve fish that hasn't been pulled out of the water less than 3 hours, right? But when it comes to wheat, we've somehow convinced ourselves that it's okay to cook and bake with what is essentially rotten produce. We eat dead wheat. And I'm not just talking about this stuff, although I am, wheat that's been literally deadened by an industrial process to remove its germ. I'm talking about this stuff where white flour comes from. Modern varieties of wheat that are bred for yield and yield alone, they have very little nutrition, they have absolutely no flavor, they're grown in denuded soils, and a lot of chemical fertilizers are added to make them grow. If you're using this wheat, and we all use this wheat because this is where wheat comes from, it's the equivalent of trying to build a delicious menu around this stuff. It's crazy, right? But we do it every single day. How is that possible? How is it possible that we're here today as advocates for flavor, advocates for our appetites, and yet we willingly, we even happily cook and bake with a dead ingredient? And not just an ingredient, but a staple. A farmer once said to me, he said, we do it because we've lost the taste of wheat. Well, that was right. We've lost the taste of wheat. So how did that happen? And more importantly, how can we reclaim it? That's what I'd like to talk about today. And it is a story that does not start with chefs. It doesn't start with farmers, but it starts with breeders. And the recipes they're writing long before anything comes into our kitchen. And it is a story, it has this kind of like Shakespearean thing about it. Or at least, I'm going to try and make it that way. With drama and sort of intrigue. So we're going to tell this like a play in 3 acts, okay? So Act 1. Act 1 is once upon a time, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, farmers grew and saved varieties of wheat based on culture, based on climate, based on cuisine. Hundreds of thousands of flavors and varieties. They were highly adapted, they were highly specialized, and they were absolutely delicious. And they were not grown in monocultures, of course. They were grown in mixed agriculture with animals and vegetables and roots and grains. So that you would plant wheat, but you would also plant soy, and you would also plant a brassica, and you'd plant a root vegetable, and you'd be sure to have some kind of poultry running around the farm, and of course pigs, definitely, and you'd have cattle for dairy, you'd have cattle for beef, pasturing on the grass. And you rotated these things in a very specific and thoughtful order, and the key to that was that you thought of your soil as a kind of bank account. So that each time you made a harvest, you were withdrawing from the bank. And each subsequent planting was like a deposit in the bank. And that kept the fertility full, that kept the farm going, that kept the food nutritious, and undoubtedly, if things went right, it kept it nutritious, delicious as well. This was organic farming before there was such a thing as organic farming. The diversity above ground fed this community of soil organisms below ground, and the community of soil organisms below ground fed the root and then ultimately the plant. Now that's a reductive way to talk about a very complex cycle, but the core of it is that the soil takes care of itself. It self-sustains. It actually improves itself if you work within this cycle. So what happened to the cycle? What happened to the system? Well, every country represented here today has a story about the decline of farming, the decline of diversity, the decline of cuisine, the decline of flavor. But when it comes to wheat, we can really point our fingers at one guy. And his name was Dr. Norman Borlaug. And though I am tempted to label him the villain of the story, I'm really hard-pressed to, because he's the most famous breeder, like ever. And he is widely considered the father of the Green Revolution, the most important agricultural time in the history of mankind. But Borlaug did change wheat irrevocably. He changed it completely. And he did it in just a few years. And he did it with good intentions, which is part of the problem. It was the late 1950s, it was the 60s, the world faced these pockets of massive starvation and malnutrition. Borlaug's goal was really simple: grow more wheat, feed more people. And he did it. He did it in large part by convincing farmers to abandon that mixed farming system and grow monocultures of wheat. Just one variety, wall-to-wall plantings, increase harvests, increase the amount of wheat that we could feed people. The problem with that is that when you plant one thing of anything, of course, you run into all sorts of problems, but the one I'm most interested in here today is soil fertility declines, and it declines really quickly. So the very thing that you're trying to increase and harvest ultimately declines. Borlaug's answer to that was really simple: add chemical fertilizers. That worked, and actually it worked too well, which brought upon another problem. The wheat stalk shot up, it was thin, it was undeveloped. The seed head, because of all these fertilizers, was rich. So a light rain, a little wind, and it bent over. It lodged on the ground, making harvest next to impossible, which is where the breeding came in. Borlaug crossed conventional wheat like that with a variety of dwarf wheat like that called Norin 10. It's from Japan. And he created a semi-dwarf wheat that responded really well to the chemical fertilizers but did not fall over, stayed up. Harvests were sweet and clear and concise and abundant. This neat little breeding trick doubled harvests within 10 years, nearly tripled them. Some scientists, cultural observers, say 1 billion of us are alive today. 1 billion of us are alive today because of this breeding advance. So, environmental problems, societal problems that resulted from all these chemical fertilizers that were being used in the Green Revolution, it's all been written about, it's been talked about. But what hasn't been written about, what hasn't been talked about nearly enough, are the implications for flavor. For one thing, when you plant wheat as successfully as Borlaug did, you're going to suffer from diversity. Because his wheats caught on in Mexico like fire. They caught on in Asia. They spread throughout all of Asia and then throughout the rest of the world. In fact, it was so successful, we're still eating Borlaug's semi-dwarf wheats today. The result of that is that you had a decline in that gene pool, that thousands and thousands of years that farmers saved varieties based on great flavor, based on good pest resistance, based on good ecological resiliency. They lost out. They could not compete with the yields, especially with chemical fertilizers. And the results were disastrous for flavor. Because when you farm in a mixed farming system, you're not just feeding the plant, you're feeding the soil. You're paying back the bank. The bank is rich. I've actually become really obsessed with the bank. Scientists have said for so long that in a teaspoon of healthy soil, there's millions and millions of organisms. In fact, recently, scientists have discovered that number is far too conservative. In 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, there's 1 billion organisms, maybe more. 1 billion organisms in 1 teaspoon. We, chefs, and really anyone who cares about food, we tend to think that variety, climate, geography, the brilliance of a farmer, forgetting about the brilliance of a chef, those are the drivers for flavor. But trust me when I tell you that the more I learn about this, the more I realize we know so little about flavor. What every soil scientist will tell you is that flavor starts right here in the abundance of soil organisms. I am not a soil biologist. Obviously, everything I know about soil biology, I could tell you in a haiku. But I have gotten to understand the kind of global theme. The global theme of what we want, what chefs want our vegetables growing in, and our fruits, and our grains. And that's this. We want soil that is abundantly healthy with organisms and microorganisms. The diversity below the soil helps take advantage of whatever is available above the soil, like leaves, fallen leaves, or dead plants, or manure, and even just below the soil with roots, and so forth. The more diversity you have below ground, the more potential you have to bring that diversity to the subsoil. And once these organisms bring that diversity to the subsoil, they break it down. And after they break it down, they eat it. And then they themselves are eaten. So that you might get like an amoeba attacking bacteria, but that same amoeba would be attacked by a fungus, and then the fungus would be attacked by a nematode, and then another nematode would come along and attack that. There is no rhyme or reason to this. The point is, there's a lot of action. The result of all the action is this. It's thick, rich, black dirt, humus, organic matter. That's the money in the bank. And it's not just biological, it's not just stuff we can see or see under a microscope. It is also chemical. The entire periodic table is represented here, but only in healthy soil. Which means that the plant has a complex and rich diversity from which to choose. Which means, or which translates to, a rich and complex taste profile when that stuff comes into our kitchen. What happens when you use chemical fertilizers? You bypass the periodic table. You bypass soil. You feed the plant, not the soil, you feed the plant directly. And you generally do it, at least today, you generally do it with 3 elements, not the periodic table, 3 elements, N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those are hugies for the plant, right? The plant responds really well to those. Those are big building blocks, and it will grow, and it'll grow very fast. But the plant neither has the time nor the diversity available to it to grow whatever it's growing with true flavor complexity. A farmer that I admire greatly named Elliot Coleman said this, and I think it sums it up perfectly. The idea that we could ever substitute a few soluble elements, that's NPK, for a whole living system is like thinking an intravenous needle could administer a delicious meal. Okay, so the perfect storm. You have breeding techniques, you have farming techniques, and what it gets you are wheats that are anonymous and nameless, and for the most part nutritionalist, and definitely not delicious. Act 2. If Act 1 is about the death of wheat, Act 2 is about its resurrection. It began with an email that I received from Lisa Abent. Lisa's here today, and she is going to act like, for our story anyway, the intrepid foreign correspondent or whatever. She's a writer, a brilliant writer and journalist for Time magazine. Lisa emailed because she was writing about an old Spanish variety called Aragon 3. Aragon 3 had totally disappeared in the last 50 years for the same reasons that all these wheats have disappeared for the last 50 years. They can't compete with the mighty dwarfs. But, as the story goes, there was a family in a small northeastern Spanish town that planted and saved Aragon 3. They did that out of tradition, they did that out of pest resistance, and they did it out of flavor. And they were so successful at it, they convinced the entire town to save and plant Aragon 3. So there was this pocket in northeastern Spain, this tiny town, that was growing this old variety of wheat that could not compete with Borlaug's varieties or any of the semi-dwarf varieties, but in yield, but far surpassed them in flavor and apparently in nutrition. So Lisa thought, this is a great idea for a story, and I thought, this is a great idea for an addition to a menu. Why not reclaim some of this lost genetic material, and why not introduce my diners to this idea of wheat as a taste, wheat having flavor? So I went about trying to convince some local farmers to grow Aragon 3. And just about at that moment, we had a devastating event at the farm, which was called late blight. Late blight is this fungal disease that hits tomatoes and potatoes. And if you're an organic farmer, and this year especially, you were growing tomatoes and potatoes, you were wiped out completely. I went out to the field with Jack Algier, the brilliant Stone Barns farmer, and we stood in front of what was going to harvest 1,000 pounds of tomatoes a week, and we had 0. You know, it was Chernobyl. And I'm standing there, and we're in this kind of mourning state, and then all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see a small little row of beautifully ripe, beautifully red, plump tomatoes. Jack tells me that these tomatoes are an experimental variety from the breeders at Cornell University. So I got up close to them, of course, and I started to look at them. And you know, my first reaction was like, they look like supermarket tomatoes. They were like too perfect, too red, too plump, without the lumps and bumps of the heirlooms that we've come to associate with great flavor. So I had very, very low expectations, but I was exactly wrong. They were delicious. They had great acidity, they had incredible sweetness, and they had actually a fullness to their flavor that we often don't get from heirlooms. So I went back to Lisa's email and Aragon 3. Just a few days later, I got to thinking, instead of saving Aragon 3, what about breeding Aragon 3 for flavor? And that's what got me to Dr. Steve Jones. Steve is this renowned breeder who you've probably never heard of. Besides being a brilliant, brilliant scientist, he is also a total gastronome. He spends his days in the field and in the laboratory, but at night and on weekends, he is baking bread with his own varieties of wheat. He's obsessed with bread. He's actually obsessed with all food, but he's particularly obsessed with wheat. And he's also the most complete insomniac I've ever met. I'm keeping a collection of his emails at 3 in the morning, which include his experimenting, his play-by-play experimentation with making his own malt extract, and his figuring out how to dry a starter dough, starter slurry for his doughs into candy bar size travel packs that he takes with him when he goes on the road so he can bake if he ever gets the urge in the middle of the night. And then, just this morning, at about 3:30, almost like clockwork, he sent me an email titled, "Waterboarding My Wheat." And he has now been experimenting with drowning and starving his varieties of wheat to make them sprout because he believes that under stress they sprout and they produce better flavor and better nutrition. Anyway, I presented Aragon 3 to Steve, and he said right away, of course, let's breed Aragon 3 with another variety. Let's accentuate those characteristics that that family in northeastern corner of Spain loved, and let's even make it better. And let's marry it with a variety that's local to you to ensure that those genetics continue into the future. Actually said, we want to marry it, but he added, to get the qualities you're looking for, we may even menage a trois it. Okay, so Act 3, and Barber wheat. I would say to you that Barber wheat is not a resurrection as much as this is about a reinvention. I just came back from seeing it 2 hours from the Seattle airport where Steve has his breeding center. It is located in what's called the Skagit Valley. This tiny corner of the country, it turns out, has some of the best farmland in the world. We are talking top 2% of the farmland in the world. And when you know it, the first thing Steve says to me when I'm out there is not about genetics, it's not about the brilliance of breeding, it's about soil. All he wants to talk about is soil, and what he tells me is that the soil in the Skagit originated from a geological phenomenon, but it's been kept healthy because of the farmers. The farmers, for the most part, farm on a small scale, but more interestingly, they have a rotation system across the entire valley. It's this kind of shared rotation system. And so in other words, you have on these 90,000 acres, this system writ large. For the farmers, they've always grown wheat. They need the fertility for the soil. They lose money on every harvest. The farmer told me when I was out there, he's trying to figure out throughout his career how to lose a little bit less money every year on the wheat. Why? Because it's generic wheat, because they sell it abroad, it's nameless, it's homogeneous. There's basically, the lowest common denominator market for it. Steve came along and he said, this is crazy. Why aren't you growing varieties of wheat that actually give you more soil fertility, but are specific to the place? That one farm has a particular variety because of its soil conditions, because it's in a valley, and another, a mile, 2, 3 away, has a completely different wheat because of its ecological reality. And then, why aren't we partnering with chefs and bakers to create a market for this stuff? They'll be willing to pay for it because it's going to taste so good. And he convinced the farmers, and that's what he does. This is the view from his office. It is an 8-acre experimental field. It has 40,000 experimental lines. 40,000. Just for a second, compare that with this, where all of our wheat comes from. A system like this, like Steve's, makes a mockery of the idea that wheat is generic and wheat is anonymous and wheat doesn't have as much potential for flavor as a tomato. By the way, that's my Barber wheat, flourishing amongst its comrades. What is so incredible is not just this variety, it's the technology that he puts into play. We think of breeders as either old school guys, taking their entire career to tinker with some genes and get one variety that they name after themselves or their mother. Or we think of breeder as like Monsanto maniacs, creating frankenfood for the masses. Steve is somewhere in the middle. He works with genome maps. He works with marker-assisted selection. He works with molecular cytogenetics. This is not genetic modification. It's not even close. He's taking old world breeding and he's marrying it with the most up-to-date and modern technology. It allows him to predict with almost this unreal accuracy what the wheat will look like, what it'll perform like, and what it'll taste like. You might say, in some ways, that he is writing a recipe just like chefs. Although he, as obsessed as I get with the technology, he keeps coming back to the soil. Actually, what he comes back to is that stop getting caught up in all the gee whiz shit. Because really, none of this stuff works unless the soil is healthy. Unless the soil has that fertility, none of the stuff that he's breeding works. We won't taste the flavor, we won't get the pest resistance, and on and on. The more I know him, actually, the more he reminds me of a chef. And this past year, he built a bread lab for $1.2 million. What is a bread lab? The bread lab has the standard tools, like the millers and the ovens and the mixers. And then he has this non-standard shit all over the place. This is an alveograph. An alveograph measures the extensibility of the dough. In other words, it will rank how much air bubbles you can get in that beautiful open European crumb that we all look for. And he can know it long before the wheat gets out of the field and long before it gets into our ovens. There are countless other machines here for protein numbers and falling numbers and ash contents and all the things that make great wheat and ultimately great bread. But the thing that struck me is it's not just a test kitchen, it's a classroom. He has bakers and malters and chefs coming in all the time. And they're telling him, actually, let's start with, he's telling them what he's breeding, and they're responding. They're learning that wheat has a taste and a certain function, and they're going back and tinkering with their bread recipes. But Steve, just as importantly, learns from the chefs and learns from the bakers, and he goes back to his breeding lab and he tinkers with his work to create the varieties to respond to the chefs and the bakers with amazing accuracy. While I was out there, I got to taste some of these wheats, and you taste spicy, you taste wheatgrass, you taste apricot. There is an overwhelming majority opinion that the Skagit Valley produces wheat of chocolate flavor, and I tasted that, and it's incredible. We may have lost the taste of wheat, and yet here it was, and they were not flavors of the past. They were flavors of the future. Which makes me think that this Barber wheat story isn't so much a story or a play, but an allegory. Because the idea is the same, whether we're talking about wheat or tomatoes or turnips, and that's this. As chefs, we look to the past for flavor. We may have brought innovation and modernity into the kitchen, but where ingredients are concerned, we've privileged the heirloom and the heritage breed. And we do it for good reason, because usually that stuff tastes better. But in doing that, we've overlooked breeders like Steve, who now with this technology, and it's just 20 years old, more or less, they can accurately predict what wheat will taste like and act like in your locality. At Stone Barns, Jack Algier, the farmer, has partnered with breeders all around the country. And we are breeding varieties of vegetables that often don't work or don't taste good, but they've opened up a whole new world of tastes and textures. This one is a butternut squash that actually, in some ways, came out of a conversation, started long before the conversation, but it encapsulated for me. We invited the breeders down for dinner from Cornell. This squash was bred by a guy named Mike Mazurek. And when he came in the kitchen, we were obsessed with certain types of squash. And I was like, Mike, we're looking for this type of flavor in this butternut squash. And he said, stop. No one has ever asked me to breed for flavor. Now, he's a breeder who's been breeding for 20 years. No one has ever asked him to breed for flavor. And what that did for me is convince me that for the future, our mandate, all of us here, is not just to recapture old flavors, but to invent new ones in the field. Now, that may sound like a little bit of hyperbole, but it's not. Chefs and bakers and waiters and backwaiters and restaurateurs and writers, we all shape the food cultures in our own country and in our own towns. Not just the particular varieties that we eat, but the way that they're grown, which affects, in the words of the great writer Wendell Berry, the way the world is used. If you doubt that, and many do, just imagine a world where there was a large-scale demand for that versus what we have. What we have in America, anyway, is 120 million acres of that and a few acres of that. Imagine if we created an economy for that. We'll take 5%. I'll take 5%. 5% of 120 million. It's over 5 million acres of wheat that we could bring back flavor, bring back strong ecology, and improve the whole ecological system for an area. I'll end with this. There is a debate going on in America, throughout the world, about the role of the chef. Are we to remain only in the kitchen, or are we ambassadors for something much, much larger? I'm not going to get into that. Because if I say to you that chefs can, and the chefs in this room will change the world, someone out there is going to call me a preening idiot. I know that because they already have. And if I say to you, well, we should just put our heads down and cook in the kitchen, many of you will say, oh, shit, you're selling us short. So I'm going to say this instead. This whole farm-to-table movement is the wrong way of thinking about it. Because it sets up us as end users. We're passive. Where really we need to do a little more work here. We need to engage with breeders like Steve and breeders all around the world who now have the technology and the wherewithal, but not the impetus and definitely not the palate to create the kind of flavors we need for the future. What Steve realized, and really I think his brilliance in all of this, is that in building the bread lab, he realized that none of his work mattered unless it was tethered to cuisine. Unless there was a food culture behind everything he was doing. So when you think about it, it's actually the most exciting opportunity we can have to redefine our diets and our appetites from the ground up. Thank you.